If there is a Chevrolet paradise on earth, it is in Uzbekistan. In this Central Asian country, the American brand reached a position most automakers can only dream of. This was no longer just the success story of one brand in one market. It was a full monopoly. At its peak in 2011, Chevrolet's market share in Uzbekistan reached an incredible 94%. For General Motors, it looked like a dream come true. No competition and a country where Chevrolet became not just a foreign brand, but effectively a national car mark. But how did an American brand achieve such a position in Uzbekistan? And most importantly, were ordinary people in the country actually happy about it? Uzbekistan is a fairly large country in Central Asia, with a population of around 38 million people. And until 1991, it was part of the Soviet Union. And despite the regional stereotypes that some viewers may have, this was not simply an agricultural country living only from cotton, livestock, and farming. Yes, the cotton industry was one of Uzbekistan's key sectors, but it was far from the only one. Even if you are not especially interested in aviation, you have probably seen this aircraft at least once. This is the famous Ilyushin IL-76, one of the most recognizable and widely produced transport aircraft in the world. And it was built in Uzbekistan at the Tashkent Aviation Production Association. The country also had developed machine building, chemical, and textile industries. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, many enterprises found themselves in a much worse position, and some were later shut down completely. As in many former Soviet countries, Uzbekistan entered difficult economic times. Even so, the country's leadership under Islam Karimov set a course in the early 1990s to create its own automotive industry. Uzbekistan could not handle such a project on its own, so the country needed a foreign partner. That partner became the South Korean company Daewoo, which at the time was highly ambitious and was trying to expand its presence across very different markets, from Asia to North America. As a result, in 1993, the joint venture Uzdaewoo Auto was created, with the Uzbek side and Daewoo each holding 50%. Construction of the plant in Osaka began in 1994, and in 1996, serial production of the first cars started there. The plant was designed to produce around 250,000 cars a year. Production began with 3 models at once: the Daewoo Nexia, Damas, and Tico. The first models were chosen quite well and landed exactly in the niches that could give them steady demand. The Nexia became a normal sedan for private buyers and taxi drivers. In a region where sedans were traditionally seen as the most prestigious body style, the Nexia almost immediately became a desirable car for many people. The compact Damas was a microvan for families, trade, and small businesses, and it also fit the needs of the market very well. And the little Tico became an option for those who had not yet earned enough for a Nexia, but already wanted a car of their own. It was the cheapest entry into personal car ownership, an alternative to a used Lada, but with the feeling of a new foreign car. But Daewoo's success in Uzbekistan had one important catch. From the very beginning, the government introduced serious barriers against imported cars. And although Daewoo did not yet belong to General Motors, this was the period when the future Chevrolet monopoly began to take shape. Imported cars were subject to duties of 30% of their customs value, plus up to $3 for every cubic centimeter of engine displacement. In the end, all the payments could add more than 100% to the price of a car. Formerly, you could buy a car from another brand, but if customs clearance made it twice as expensive, for most buyers it simply stopped making sense. Daewoo became the only real option for buying a new car. There was no serious outside pressure on Uzbekistan to remove these barriers either. The IMF did criticize the country's economic policy for being closed and lacking necessary reforms, but that was about the broader economic model, not just the car industry. Other automakers were not rushing to build plants in Uzbekistan either. For major companies like Ford or Volkswagen, the market was too small. In 2001, only about 56,000 new cars were sold in the entire country. A closed economy, corruption, and unpredictable rules made it even less attractive. So Daewoo received almost ideal conditions in Uzbekistan. But outside the country, Daewoo itself was doing worse and worse. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis hit many Korean companies hard, and Daewoo was no exception. Before that, the company had been aggressively expanding with borrowed money, buying assets, building factories, entering new markets, and launching new models. As long as the economy was growing, it looked like bold expansion. When the crisis hit demand and credit, the same strategy turned into a trap. Daewoo's management seems to have either underestimated the scale of the crisis or realized too late how dangerous the situation had become. Instead of urgently cutting risks, Daewoo bought a controlling stake in the troubled SsangYong Motor in 1998. That deal did not save the company. It only added new debts and new problems. Within a year, Daewoo had run out of safety margin and began collapsing under the weight of enormous debts. Different sources estimate those debts at roughly $50 to $80 billion. It became one of the largest corporate collapses in South Korean history. In November 2000, Daewoo Motor was officially declared bankrupt. It might seem that the story should have ended there, but it did not, because this was exactly when General Motors entered the scene. In 2002, General Motors bought the key parts of the bankrupt South Korean company, Daewoo Motor. But GM did not buy them because Daewoo was a strong business on its own. As a whole, the company was not especially attractive to the Americans. In pieces, however, Daewoo was very valuable. Factories, engineers, ready-made platforms, cheap compact cars, and access to markets where GM was weak. General Motors had a long-standing problem. The company was good at building large American cars, pickups, and SUVs, but it was weaker in cheap compact cars, both for its own market and for developing countries. Daewoo knew how to build exactly what GM needed. The Matiz, Lanos, Nubira, Laganza, Kalos, and other inexpensive models for Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and other markets. The deal was also fairly cheap for the Americans. GM invested $251 million and received 42.1% of the new company, GM Daewoo. The whole deal was valued at around $1.2 billion. For comparison, only a few years earlier, Ford had offered about $6.9 billion for Daewoo, but the Korean side rejected the offer. The Uzbek plant was not included in that deal. The Americans did not receive half of the Osaka factory, and in 2005, the government of Uzbekistan bought out the Korean share itself and became the plant's sole owner. But that did not solve the main problem. Uzbekistan still could not develop its car industry without a foreign partner. The plant had been built, production was running, people were already used to Daewoo, but the old partner had disappeared. So Tashkent began looking for a replacement and first turned to General Motors. On paper, Uzbekistan did not look like the most obvious place for GM. In 2008, the country ranked 138th out of 181 in the Doing Business ranking. The rules of the game remained difficult and unpredictable, and foreign investors already had reasons to be cautious. So why did General Motors agree anyway? The answer is simple. GM was not walking into nothing. Uzbekistan already had a working factory, trained workers, models that buyers knew, dealers, and no real competition. For an automaker, this was a rare case where a difficult country offered an almost ready-made market. In 2007, the two sides agreed to create a new joint venture based on Daewoo Auto. In March 2008, GM Uzbekistan appeared. But unlike Daewoo, General Motors did not receive half of the plant. It received 25% plus one share. Control remained with the Uzbek side. Under the new agreements, GM helped modernize production, introduce new technologies, train staff, and expand the model range under the Chevrolet brand. Uzbekistan wanted not only to meet demand inside the country, but also to turn the plant into an export base. The first Chevrolets appeared even before GM Uzbekistan was fully launched. In 2007, semi-knockdown assembly of the Takuma, Epica, and Captiva began. And in 2008, the new company began operating at full strength, while the old Daewoo models started receiving the Chevrolet name and the bow tie on the grille. As with Daewoo before it, the government carefully and aggressively protected the local market from imports. The import barriers remained in place, and GM Uzbekistan received an extra bonus on top of that, 10 years of tax benefits. At the same time, Uzbekistan was still not the most attractive market for major global automakers. Unlike China, where almost everyone wanted to be because the potential sales and profits were enormous, the Uzbek market was much more modest. In that same telling year of 2011, GM Uzbekistan produced 225,000 cars. Inside Uzbekistan, 121,000 were sold. The remaining 104,000 went for export. 225,000 cars is certainly not a tiny number, but it is not the kind of scale that makes the world's biggest automakers line up at the door, especially when the market was already set up around one manufacturer, which could now be considered local. Were Uzbeks themselves happy about this? The answer is not that simple. On the one hand, Chevrolets really did become people's cars. They were familiar, easy to understand, repairable, had widely available spare parts, and held their value well on the used market. In a country where everyone drives the same models, this becomes an advantage. Any mechanic knows the Nexia, Matiz, Lacetti, Cobalt, or Damas. Parts are available everywhere, and selling the car later is relatively easy. On the other hand, a controlled market and limited supply created queues and shortages. It is important to understand that the population of the country was not wealthy, and for many people, buying a car was not an ordinary purchase, but a major family goal. Not only was the choice narrowed down to one brand, but even simply walking into a dealership and buying a car was often impossible. You had to sign a contract, pay the money, and wait. The waiting time depended on the model, the dealer, and the particular period. If you were lucky, it could be a few weeks or months. If you were not, you could wait more than a year for your Chevrolet. As a result, Uzbekistan became one of the few countries in the 21st century where a used car could cost more than a new one, because a new one had to be waited for, while a used one was right in front of you, here and now. That is why attitudes toward Chevrolet in Uzbekistan were, and still are, rather mixed. In 2025, Chevrolet still held most of the Uzbek market. A total of 427,097 new cars were sold in the country, and 355,379 of them were Chevrolets. In other words, even after all the changes, the brand still held more than 80% of the market. But the old monopoly had already begun to erode. The remaining 71,718 cars came from other brands, and Chinese companies were becoming increasingly visible among them. The old import barriers had been partly softened, while the government created especially favorable conditions for electric cars and hybrids by removing customs duties and excise taxes. This was the door through which Chinese models began entering the market rapidly. In 2022, the Chinese automaker BYD and the government of Uzbekistan agreed to create a joint venture. And in 2024, the BYD Uzbekistan factory in Jizak began serial production. Chevrolet's share will most likely continue to decline. But even if the market keeps opening up, the brand's position will remain very strong. Chevrolet is too deeply embedded in Uzbekistan's automotive life. Production, dealers, service, spare parts, the used car market, and buyer habits. So if there is a Chevrolet paradise on earth, it is in Uzbekistan.